My favorite memories as a teenager were, taking the night train from Geneva and, waking up in some Italian city, and suddenly you're in a different world, but you're in a past world. And I think that even though at the time wasn't imagining that I was going to become a historian, or definitely not a historian of ideas, but you're just constantly presented with all this interesting past, and it forces you to be curious and to wonder, gee, like, what happened here? How did we go from this place to where we are today? I'm so excited about the past. I find it so fascinating, so interesting. But, I think that kind of enthusiasm and excitement is very contagious. And I know that the students pick up on it in particular.
Welcome to the Civic Agora, a podcast from the Stanford Civics Initiative, where we discuss ideas on democracy and citizenship. Hi everyone, welcome to a new episode of the Civic Agora. I'm your host, Javier Mejia, and today I had the great pleasure of speaking with Dan Edelstein. Dan is the William H. Bonsall Professor of French at Stanford, and he is also part of the faculty steering committee of the Stanford Civics Initiative. We talked with Dan about civic education. Dan has led the college program for several years. The college program is an important part of civic education at Stanford. And we also talked with Dan about his latest book, a book published by Princeton University Press a couple of months ago called The Revolution to Come. It is a book about the idea of revolution. A very interesting book. I encourage you to stay till the end of the conversation to listen to this. And I encourage you also to follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, on Twitter X. We're also on YouTube and Spotify. And I also encourage you to take a look at our website where we have the list of all our courses, their syllabi, and a bunch of material that you might find interesting if you are interested in civic education. Take a look at our episode. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for being here. We're going to be talking today about your career, your life, and your book. Your book, it's called The Revolution to Come, a history of an idea from Thucydides to Lenin. It's fascinating. I'm really eager to ask you many things about it. But let's start first with your career and your life. You're an expert on the political thought of Europe, and I want to know how you ended up doing that. How you ended up being interested in this topic. You're American, so it's not an obvious thing to be interested in. So why don't you tell me more about your career and your life?
Well, probably the most significant thing that happened to me was at a fairly young age. When I was 5, my parents went to Paris for a year. My dad's also a professor, a scientist, so we were on sabbatical. And then we did it again when I was 9. So by that point, the family spoke French. And then when I was 11, we actually moved to Geneva, Switzerland for good. And so I grew up in Switzerland. I stayed all the way through college. And so my education really was European. I was, educated in French. I had to learn German, eventually had to learn Latin as well in college. But I think more than just being educated in a different system, there's something about growing up in Europe that I think makes you just experience and think about history differently. That in America, it's a little too easy sometimes to think that history just goes back 250 years, or that 250 years ago there was this huge break and the stuff that happened before that isn't really all that relevant. And it's just, you can't really think that way in Europe, because you're constantly surrounded by the past, and even the fairly distant past. So, some of my favorite memories as a teenager were, taking the night train from Geneva and, waking up in some Italian city, and suddenly you're in a different world, but you're in a past world. And I think that even though at the time I wasn't imagining that I was going to become a historian, or definitely not a historian of ideas, but you're just constantly presented with all this interesting past, and it forces you to be curious and to wonder, gee, like what happened here? How did we go from this place to where we are today?
And what about like, I guess here I'm curious about how in your daily life you can signify that experience. And I guess what I have in mind here is you come back to this environment that has this short perspective of history, quite American focus, and you want to argue that this very long history that goes back to things that people were saying in ancient Greece is relevant for thinking our world today. How do you try to communicate that to the people outside academia, I guess, or at least your immediate community of fellows that are experts in Europe?
Well, it's true that coming to California is perhaps the place on earth that feels the least connected to the past, um, and almost as if we're hardly even connected to the present, right? It's all about living in the future. So I do feel a little bit out of place, and I guess to some extent out of time as well. Um, I guess the way I think about your question is really primarily as a teacher. How do I communicate the importance of the past to students? And I guess, in my case, I just am so excited about the past. I find it so fascinating, so interesting, such great stories, such amazing events and surprises. And so I think that you're trying to pass on this enthusiasm about the past and showing how, yeah, just how much fun it is to think with these great writers, to think about these momentous events. It's thrilling, and I think students they pick up on that pretty quickly. The thrill of the past, and so I think it helps too that I started off really as a modernist. In college, I was much more interested in 20th century poetry, and I just sort of been in free fall through the centuries ever since then. But it does mean that, when I encountered Thucydides, Polybius, the authors who I really focus on in my book, it was with kind of the freshness of a student, not as somebody who's been studying them for, you know, 30 years. And whenever I talk to my classicist friends, they always sort of remark on I bring this almost puppy energy to the study of the classics because it's still so fresh and amazing to me. So I think that kind of enthusiasm and excitement is very contagious, and I know that I think students pick up on it in particular.
But it's an art, right? Trying to communicate passion to a group of younger people that have very different cultural benchmarks. It's a true art, and I want to hear more about that. I want to ask you more about your experience as a teacher, and there's this big course that you had led for a while at Stanford, Citizen in the 21st Century. Why don't you tell us more about what the course is, how it came about, what do you think it is important? Let us know what's your vision behind the course, and what's the reception of students, because it's been already taught for a couple of years. A very large number of students have taken it. What's your perception today compared with when it was first started?
So you're referring to this class that, in some respects is the centerpiece of a new first year requirement at Stanford, called Civic, Liberal, and Global Education when we shorten it to college as a kind of faux acronym. And college goes back now to about 5 years, when we put it through, the faculty senate, and I think that what excited me about this process is that, as a historian and as a historian of ideas, um, I've always been well, not always, but I had become very interested in the history higher education, especially in this country. I'd become very interested, especially in the history of liberal education. And I think it helped that I had gone to school in Switzerland, which is a very different system. I declared my major before setting foot at the university. In many respects, I did not have a liberal education in that it was very focused in a particular discipline, namely literature. And so coming back to the States, teaching here, I've again sort of had this sort of eagerness, this excitement for a model of education that is not the one that I had had. But I was also seeing that many of my colleagues didn't seem to have that commitment, didn't seem to have that care for it, um, and also didn't often really know that much about the history of the different forms of higher education in this country, or even more broadly throughout the West. Um, so I think that I what happened was really sort of a number of things came together. Some of them were specific to Stanford, some of them have broader national resonance. But there was this moment, maybe about almost 10 years ago now, when started to be a certain malaise in higher education, a sense that students were approaching higher education in a much more instrumental way, that they were really thinking about majors directly in terms of careers, so that, why would you major in philosophy unless you wanted to be a philosopher? They weren't really seeing what had been the initial idea and ideal of liberal education. So we wanted to bring that back. And that's what this college program is really about. Some of it is like in the fall quarter, we really spend some time with the students just thinking about the history of liberal education, going all the way back to the Greeks, the idea of education for a good life, and that it's not just about preparing you for your career, but it is preparing you for a full life and for multiple careers. So that's what we do in the fall. But citizenship has always been at the heart of liberal education, even before it had that name. So for the Greeks, Aristotle talks about, you need a particular kind of education for free people. So that freedom in liberal education really refers to a kind of government. And that's why also the Romans start talking about the studia, liberalia, and the liberal arts are always, the kinds of knowledge that freed people need. Now, of course, there's complexities there. There's a built-in distinction between freed and unfreed people. There's questions about what does this mean in under a monarchy or sort of not in a democracy. But once this sort of story gets back to the United States, many universities, including Stanford, are founded on this belief that educated graduates are necessary for the citizenry of a state and the country. So in Stanford's founding charter, one of the purposes of the university is, to teach the blessings of liberty regulated by law. And it goes on to quote both the Declaration of Independence and the preamble to the Constitution. And I think we lost track of the civic purpose of universities, especially over the last 30 years. So the citizenship class is an attempt to bring that back. It's been a really fun and exciting process because the class has changed a lot over the course of 5 years. I think what's crucial about this class is that we teach it in these small sections. So it's capped at around 16 students, and we've realized that we really want these classrooms to be almost like the practice spaces of democracy. So the emphasis is a little bit less on how many you know how many members of the House of Representatives are there, or what does it take for a bill to become a law, and we really try to instill in our students, I guess, both a civic mindset and certain key civic skills. So the civic mindset is just recognizing that as the citizen of any democratic country, you will be called upon to vote on a whole range of things. In California, you're always voting on all these propositions, and for that to work, you have to be willing to at least do a little bit of homework and understand the issues, have that sense that, you have a responsibility as a citizen to contribute. But then also you really need a certain set of skills that are largely communicative skills. Being able to express your point of view without necessarily um, triggering an emotional response from others, being willing to listen to others and to really weigh their perspective and not short circuit that by immediately jumping in and telling them they're wrong. So these skills that are pretty much essential if you want to have a functioning democracy also turn out to be really helpful to have a flourishing campus environment so that our students feel like they can fully express themselves and get the most out of living in a residential situation. But more and more, we hear from our alumni that this is also something they're really looking for in recent graduates. That in a work environment, you need to have these same skills as well. So over time, the course has really moved a little bit more in the direction of both giving students these skills and then using the multiple topics in the course as an opportunity to practice them.
That's fantastic. And I want to get back to civic education in a bit. But before that, I want to talk about the book. And I think that's going to be a good platform to open some interesting discussions about civic education again. Um, but let's start probably. So, your book is this pretty exhaustive, in my opinion, exploration of the idea of revolutions. Why don't we start by defining or trying to understand what do you understand by revolution, right? How is it different from other similar concepts out there, right? And what I have in mind here are things like rebellion, for instance. What is a revolution?
I found it really helpful to go back to the Greek terms that um, initially were used to describe what we today call revolution. And as you know, part of the book is trying to explain how did revolution, the word, come to occupy the semantic space that it does. But the Greeks actually distinguished between two distinct but sometimes related concepts. One of them is stasis, so that just really means physical conflict, people fighting in the streets or in the city. Um, but stasis could happen without necessarily there being any what we would think of as a revolution. So it could be, as you're saying, kind of a rebellion or some kind of uprising. When there was actually a regime change, the Greeks used the term metabole, um, and which is to sort of like to it would get translated in Latin as a mutation. It's like to throw something beyond, like meta, like metaphysics, and bole, just to throw. And so, as Aristotle points out in the Politics, sometimes you have both. You have an uprising, and then it leads to a regime change. So, that would be Cleisthenes, for instance, in Athens, or what we kind of today think about as a revolution. Sometimes you just have the stasis, and it doesn't get you anywhere. That's actually what happens in Corcyra in the famous revolution described by Thucydides. But interestingly, sometimes you have metabole without stasis, kind of a silent revolution. And you might see that Polybius will pick up on this when, for instance, a kingship devolves into tyranny or democracy devolves into a clocracy, a wonderful Greek word that means mob rule. So I think that in a way, our language of a revolution is a little impoverished because we only have this one word that's kind of trying to do all these different things. And so we do end up having sometimes trouble classifying different events, whether they're revolutionary or not.
I guess we're gonna get back to this then in a bit when I'm gonna ask you to help me comparing different types of revolutions, right? Different big, well-known revolutions. But before that, you introduced the book with a joke that highlights the role of consensus, right? And which is an important element in your argument. Why don't you tell us about the joke? You have a great sense of humor. I'm sure you would do a great job talking about it. But what's the deal with consensus, right? What is that an important piece in a conversation about revolution?
So I think it's a funny joke. Not everybody thinks it's that funny. So I'll start with the joke. Sometime in the 1930s, it's New York City. A factory is the workers are leaving at the end of their shift, and there's an organizer standing on the street corner, and he starts calling the workers. And says, "Workers, gather around, hear me, hear me." And as a certain crowd assembles, he says to them, "My brothers, are you not tired that all of your labor goes to fill the coffers of the wealthy owners of the factory? Brothers, do you think that is fair?" And they start saying, "No, no." "Well, brothers, listen to me. Come the revolution, you will no longer simply be working to enrich your bourgeois bosses. Come the revolution, you will all have a share of the spoils of your labor. Come the revolution, you will all eat strawberries and cream." And at that point, a little hand comes up in the crowd, and a worker timidly says, "But what if we don't like strawberries and cream?" And the organizer looks at him harshly and says, "Come the revolution, you will all like strawberries and cream." So as you said, it's a joke that is about forced consensus, the expectation of consensus, this idea that once we enter into this glorious revolutionary future, we should all want the same things, think the same way. We should all share the same idea of justice, and reason. Now, the reason I start the book with that joke is because it actually highlights, I think, the big difference between what I call the modern revolutions that emerged in the 18th century, but really with the French Revolution, and these more classical revolutions. If you told that same joke on the streets of New York in the 1770s, no one would have understood it for lots of reasons, but also it wouldn't have made sense. This punchline, like, "Come the revolution, when we've thrown the British out, everyone will like strawberries and cream." That didn't follow in 1776. Madison has this great line in the Federalist Papers where he says, "So long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to use it, different opinions will prevail." There was a sense in the classical model that um, that's where you start with disagreement, and a political constitution isn't meant to get rid of disagreement. It's supposed to find a way to channel disagreement into a structure that is not going to be ripped apart by these disagreements. Put bluntly, it's designed to prevent revolution. And that's where the first half of the book talks a lot about this theory of the well-balanced constitution as an anti-revolutionary device. And that's what goes out the window with this modern idea of history where we're constantly making progress and we will get to a point where reason prevails. And because there's only one reason, we will all agree on every point. Politics will vanish and everybody will like strawberries and cream.
Tell me more about that first era of revolutions, right? So how did we think about revolutions before modernity, in addition to, well, this absence of hope of a consensus?
Well, people thought a lot about revolutions before modernity because they typically saw revolutions as the problem that political philosophy was designed to address. In the book, I trace this back to Thucydides and the famous description of the stasis in Corcyra. And I think the reason why that's so important in this story, and it just marks people. I mean, Adams is still quoting it. Sort of, you can almost see his quill trembling as he describes what happened in Corcyra, almost 2,000 years earlier, um, is because Thucydides gives us an anatomy of a revolution. And really, it's almost the world turned upside down. Indeed, it's probably the primary source for Hobbes's State of Nature. Hobbes, of course, translates Thucydides, and it's a terrifying portrait. Revolution reveals the fact that we are basically all barbarians with a veneer of civility. But come the revolution, we will rip each other's throats open. And so revolution enters, as it were, into Western political thought as the greatest of all evils. And all political philosophers try to come up with ways to contain it. Um, and the reason that they settle on this well-balanced constitution, which you see in Plato, Aristotle, and then Polybius kind of gives a slight twist that I think will become the canonical version for later European history, is that their point of departure is that people are always going to disagree. And it's not just epistemologically, the way that sort of Madison's quote makes it sound, but it's actually socioeconomically. As Aristotle points out, every polis that you look at, and Aristotle looked at a lot of them, over 150 constitutions, the one thing that they all have in common is that there are a small number of wealthy people and a large number of poor people. I call this like the iron law of inequality. And uh, and for Aristotle, good sort of empiricist that he is, like that's your baseline. So you have to work with. And what this means for Aristotle is that no one's going to agree on a conception of justice. The wealthy are going to believe that justice is the equality of value, as he puts it. The poor are going to believe that justice is about the equality of numbers. And you can't actually resolve that. You can try, however, to strike a compromise where there's enough of both that both parties feel that they can live with it. And so that really becomes the classical idea of how do you avoid revolutions. Um, and that's why there's such a commitment to the well-balanced constitution.
Now, what does Polybius add to this story? I was actually quite surprised about the role you give him in your story. So tell me more about it, and tell me more about your discovery of his ideas. I'm also curious about how it changed your view of classic thought. But yeah, I want to hear more about Polybius. It surprised me a lot, his figure.
Yeah, he's not really one of the big guys of classical philosophy, and it's interesting because he comes quite a bit later, also, right? He's writing in the second century BC. He's writing in an age of Rome, and I think that's one of the really crucial things that Polybius adds. He takes the Greek categories of political thought, so the rule of the one, the few, and the many, both in its pure and its corrupted forms. Um, but he then applies them to what will become the best known historical example of antiquity, namely the Roman Republic. And in so doing, he gives us a much more detailed understanding of what a balanced constitution looks like in practice. And he also even breaks it down into language that through translation we still use today. So this language of checks and balances comes directly from translations of Polybius and his description of how this well-balanced constitution is supposed to work. So that's one of the things that makes him, I think, so important in the history of Western political thought. He also does this other thing that in a way is a simplification of Aristotle. And you could even see it as a minor corrective of Plato. So at the end of the Republic, Plato goes through all the different constitutions, starting with his own, and it's sort of this gradual decline. You go from sort of his aristocracy, as it were, down to the worst form of government, which is tyranny. Right before that is democracy. So we're just one step away. Aristotle, commenting on this in the Politics, asks, well, why didn't why didn't Plato then make it a circle? Like, we end here, but the story must go on. How can you just tell this in a linear way? Aristotle then also goes on to say, it's also a little silly to think that one regime can only get corrupted or move towards the next. So we have all these examples of democracies turning into oligarchies, of tyrannies going into democracies, that it's not just this sort of one-to-one model. Now, Polybius sticks with the Platonic idea that each regime is most likely to turn into one other, but he does turn it into a circle. So when you get to the bottom, you go back to the top, and it keeps going on and on and on. And I think that captures the classical sense of history really as a kind of Sisyphean cycle of suffering. It's this hamster wheel that you want to get off. And there's nothing good that can come from constantly evolving from one regime to the next. What you want to do is try to hit pause and stop this movement of history, which later medieval artists will present as the Wheel of Fortune, which of course is always it's a king, right? Who's at the top? The king, I reign, then the king falls down, I have reigned, and then at the end there's another king about to come up again. So this image of the cycle of constitutions is a very depressing one. It's not, there's nothing good there. Now, the third way in which Polybius is important in my story, and I was alluding to this earlier, is that he uses a kind of unusual Greek word to describe this circle. And this is the famous anacyclosis of Polybius. Um, it's not really found in Plato and Aristotle. They use a variant, but to refer to something else. It's not a political term that they use. And so when Polybius is rediscovered in the late 15th and 16th centuries, um, his translators have to come up with a term. What is this anacyclosis? And I think because probably the Wheel of Fortune was such an important medieval motif, and there was this common reference in Latin to the fortuna revolutionibus, the revolutions of fortune, it seems to have just naturally occurred to them, whether they were translating him into French, Italian, Latin, or English, to use revolution. And so this revolution of states or revolution of governments, that's actually where we then acquire the term revolution as a political term. And it sort of slips from meaning the whole cycle to meaning the movement from one regime to the next.
That's fascinating, right? The role of language and what it's going to be our view of events and interpretations of them. Why don't we follow then that thread and talk about modernity, right? So, what changes? What are the things changing in the views of intellectuals, political thinkers that generates a different view of revolutions?
So as I was just saying, this classical idea that's nicely illustrated by the anacyclosis of Polybius, it conveys a certain sense of history as fairly repetitive and as not leading anywhere. There's no goal. It's aimless, as it were. Marcus Aurelius has this observation in the Meditations where he says, if you look at human life for 40 years or for 10,000 years, it's no different. We're the same. We're never going to change. The same conclusion that Thucydides reaches at the end, actually, of his passage on Corcyra. So we're stuck with human nature, so we just have to deal with it. Now, what changes is that starting in the late 17th century, people start to feel that actually European society has changed a lot. We're no longer like the ancients. And it starts really by comparing achievements in the sciences, to some extent achievements in arts and letters, but there the defenders of the ancients tend to still have the upper hand. But as academics start quibbling about this. Are we better than the ancients? Have we surpassed them? It leads them to express a different understanding of history. And you start to see this in a certain number of early 18th century French thinkers, people like the Abbé de Saint-Pierre, like the Marquis d'Argenson, and then it will ultimately lead to Turgot and then Condorcet's famous sketch of a historical tableau. And for these thinkers, history actually does have a direction. We are continuously, gradually progressing towards ever more reason and justice. It's slow and it has setbacks, but in this vision, we will eventually get to a point where all of the errors and superstition that have held humanity back will be overcome. And it's in this historical vision, what I call the modern vision of historical progress, that revolution is going to acquire an entirely different value.
Tell me more about that and help me trying to address something that might feel as a paradox, which is people truly committed to the idea that history has a natural path towards something better, and that, however, then consider necessary the big effort behind running a revolution, right? How were people in this period thinking about this, the activism necessary for fitting into a broad narrative of history?
Right. And in a sense, what you're describing will become one of the great paradoxes of Marxism also. But even before we get there, in the 18th century, someone like Turgot, when he's looking at the American constitutions that have been written after 1776, so all the states have to like redo their constitution. He writes to Richard Price in England and says, I don't get it. These Americans, they're so afraid of power. They're so afraid of actually a state that can get things done. They're always all their checks and balances. This is so silly. And it very much incenses John Adams, who then goes on to write his defense of the constitutions of the United States. But I think what Turgot is highlighting is that if you believe that history has a direction and that we're moving in the direction of progress, then you don't want to design a state that's constantly putting up obstacles to prevent historical progress. You actually want the contrary. You want to design the state in a kind of nice, modernist, streamlined way so that it can just, that the history's locomotive can get us there faster. So in part, it's a response to the older classical conceptions and constructions of what a constitution should do. I think it's also about not being afraid of revolution anymore. So you see this really clearly in 1789. Revolution happens, and rather than being horrified, the deputies are embracing it. So they're not yet, the vanguard of the revolution. They're not Leninists who are sort of trying to bring it about, but they see that it has happened and they're cheering it on. And immediately revolution becomes a positive, something that you don't want to be against, because if you're against it, then you're counter-revolutionary and you're standing in the way of history. So I think that what you get over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries is this sense that revolution is inevitable, and there are people who are trying to stop it, but they're doomed for the waste bin, or perhaps the executioner's basket of history. And so there's always this sort of little need to like give history a little help along the way, but you're also doing what history wants you to. So I think it gets a little confusing eventually.
Mm, There's, I mean, here I guess what I want you to help me with is to introduce some of the context and colors in this big, broad story, right? And probably a useful way of doing that is comparing some of these iconic revolutions that happen precisely in this period when progress is emerging and consolidating, right? So what I have in mind here is the Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution, American Revolution, and the Bolshevik, right? How were they interpreted, and how do they fit into big your big story?
So the Glorious Revolution, to sort of proceed chronologically, um, I sort of think of it as part of this three-part act, which starts in 1642 with the English Civil War. Then the Glorious Revolution is sort of the middle part, and then the last part is, in fact, the American Revolution. And I'm drawing here on John Pocock, who had this edited volume called The Three British Revolutions, referring exactly to those. And I think he's quite right, because in 1688, the British do invite William of Orange to come conquer them, to get rid of James. So they are actively, getting engaging themselves. It's not just like something breaks out and then they greet it, but they're still very wary of revolution, right? They've just been through a whole bunch of them, starting in 1642, and I think that what you see is that even the way that they affix the term "glorious" to the revolution, is almost to signal its exceptionality.
Mm.
Like, this one was glorious, but generally speaking, we really don't want revolutions. And now we've got it all sorted out. I mean, all of 18th century British political thought, whether it's from the Whigs or the Tories, is to say everything got sorted out in 1688, 89. We've balanced the three parts of government. It's a very plebeian vision of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy perfectly tied up in a bow. Um, and the things they worry about are, corruption and, many actually plebeian concerns as well, that how do you sustain this over time? But constitutionally, it's all figured out. And I think that the Americans, there's a little bit of sort of this modern sense of we're entering a new world. You get this in Thomas Paine. Um, everyone will remember how great this revolution is. On the whole, though, it still looks a lot more like this, the earlier British revolutions, where they're still trying to tinker with constitutional orders to get the balance right. They end up with, in 1787, a constitution that, honestly, it doesn't look all that different than the British Constitution. You've got, an upper and lower chamber of the legislative. You have a kind of royal imperial presidency, and this sort of separation of powers, which, Montesquieu has sort of refashioned Polybius to call it the separation of powers, but really it's the sort of same old distribution of powers that you find, all the way back to the Roman Republic. So I think the real break is with the French Revolution, because they're not that interested in constitutions. They're not very good at them either. None of their constitutions last very long. But what suddenly enters the scene is this belief that the revolution itself, the process of revolution, is going to accelerate the French into a completely transfigured future where everybody is reasonable, justice rules, and they will have put all of this sort of classical division between rich and poor, behind them. And of course, that's really where Marx will pick up, and then ultimately the Bolsheviks will pick up as well.
So I think in here to bring back the strawberries and cream, right? And you have this concept of the red Leviathan, um, that highlights again this role of consensus. What's the what's the purpose of that concept, and again, what does it mean, and how important it is to understand these modern revolutions?
So the moderns are expecting the future to deliver consensus, right? Everyone should like strawberries and cream. Now, as it turns out, that almost never happens. And there are lots of people who don't like strawberries and cream or who disagree with the particular vision of revolutionary progress that is being presented to them. So that then raises this new problem for modern revolutionaries. Um, Everybody has a clear sense of where the revolution should go, what it should look like. And this sense just gets stronger and stronger over the 19th century, where you have all these utopian and socialist writers who are giving these detailed accounts of this glorious future, and everything that it will consist of. So the revolutionary imaginary is being populated during this time. But they're still stuck with this problem of how do we get there? And how do we know what the right way forward is? Most of these revolutionary groups have, to some extent, they don't want to throw it to the people because for various, again, empirical reasons and philosophical reasons, they realize that that's not going to work. Marx laments how in 1848 the provisional government holds elections, and what happens when you ask the French peasants to vote? You get a Bonaparte. So in a way, this even leads to Marx's conclusions that bourgeois democracy or constitutional democracy even is just there to support bourgeois rule. So they've taken democracy off the table, and then you have to figure out, how are we going to make decisions? How are we going to figure out the right way forward? Um, and in the Bolshevik world, this becomes the role of the party. So there's that famous speech by Trotsky where after the death of Lenin, where he says, well, of course, nobody can be right outside of the party. So the party is almost like the sort of Weltgeist of Hegel that is going to see into the future and will tell you where to go. But of course, somebody is appointing party members, somebody is choosing which members get to be in which councils. And so at the end of the day, you actually need somebody to be making these decisions, someone to say, that's revolutionary, that's not revolutionary. And that's why I think in the end, these modern revolutions actually crave a kind of what I call a red Leviathan, essentially a dictator who, like Hobbes's Leviathan, can just say, okay, this is what revolution means, the way that Hobbes's Leviathan will say, this is what the Eucharist means, or this is what other, religious often debates that can't be solved similarly to this revolutionary question of where we're headed. There's no rational solution to it. So somebody just has to decide.
How do you think that this this reflection on revolutions from a very long perspective can help us today? And here, I guess I have two different things in mind. So one is how the term revolution has diffused over a bunch of non-political spheres, and we're talking about California in the sense of we live in the future and the tech sector thinking that you actively use the term revolution, disruption probably more recently, but it's there, right? And and it's not exactly a word that is actively part of the political discussion, at least in the Western liberal democracies, I guess, right? So that's one thing, the language element of the term and and its relationship beyond just politics now. And I guess the second element I have in mind is about civic engagement, and this takes us back to civic education. What do you think we can learn from thinking about the history of the idea of revolutions for our duties as a citizen?
Great questions. So it's true that revolution has now been extended to refer to all sorts of, I guess, important transformations. So we have a scientific revolution, we have an industrial revolution, and then, driving up Highway 101, there's always some tech company, as you say, that's promoting a revolution in AI or some other, tech area. Um, I think that to some extent, that's just how language works. And so we're always adapting terms from one domain, applying them to another. I think that it gets a little bit more confusing, in fact, when people start throwing the word revolution around in a political sense without really meaning much with it. So there's a couple examples that come to mind. It's like Bernie Sanders has, he launched his political action committee or his some organization called, our revolution, our political revolution. And then when asked, like, oh, so do you want to overthrow the Constitution? It's like, oh, of course not. Like, that's not what this is about. Um, it's just like we want big change, right? But you get the same thing on the right. There are people who are heralding the Second American Revolution with respect to Trump. Um, there's my favorite example is actually the French president Emmanuel Macron, whose campaign book was also called Révolution, which for a centrist politician was rather amusing. Um, I think there, what I worry about a bit is that if you start yoking your political platform to revolution without really meaning it, then it could start to get a little confusing, especially if there are people who do mean it and who want to turn this into a real revolution. And I think that it's not as if that today feels too far fetched. I mean, there's a lot of discontent with our system. The whole the populist movements that we're seeing around the world, I think, reflect that. So part of what studying the history of revolution does, I think, is maybe just help us diagnose why there is this discontent with our institutions. Our institutions reflect, for the most part, these classical principles. They're not really designed to get a lot done. But today we bemoan that as congressional gridlock, and we say how unfair it is that those of us who live in California, like our vote compared to the vote of someone who lives in Wyoming, is marginal. All these aspects that just feel undemocratic. There's a lot of discontent with that, and I think part of it comes from the fact that even though few of us today seem to be really committed to sort of the hard version of historical progress, I think we're all kind of soft progressives, meaning, and I don't mean progressive in that political sense, just in the historical sense that we kind of do expect that the next iPhone is going to be better and faster than the last one, and that if you asked 10 people in the street, like, what do you think the world will look like 100 years from now? I'm pretty sure that no one would say, it'll be the same, like no different, right? So we have that sort of built into our expectations for the world, for the future. And so, we are moderns trapped in this world designed by ancients. I think that's a pretty uncomfortable fit that is going to, continue to express itself in all sorts of, potentially disruptive and even revolutionary ways. When it comes to civic education, I'm reminded of one of the terrible things that happens during the revolution in Corcyra, that Thucydides remarks on, which is that words lose their meaning. No one can be a moderate anymore. There's this one-upmanship where you always have to be even more violent and radical than the next person, and it just takes it stretches language, it empties it out, good becomes bad, bad becomes good. Um, and it's really fascinating, I think, that Thucydides picked up on this linguistic and communicative aspect of revolutions because um, you see that too. You see that in the French Revolution, in the sort of the discourse of the French Revolution. I think you see it in many 20th century revolutions as well. So I do think that the work we're doing in a class like Citizenship in the 21st century, and hopefully that will be done more and more throughout the country and the world as sort of this sort of renewed interest in civic education catches on, um, is practicing ways to actually move conversations and discourse in the opposite direction, sort of less polarizing, less sort of this race to who can be more extreme than the other speaker, and more actually engaging with each other, accepting that we're going to have differences, accepting essentially pluralism, maybe not just on a rich poor basis, but really on a more anthropological basis, that we do tend to disagree about things, and maybe that's part of what makes life good. And I'm hoping that this could even help us, go back to some of the Greek defenses of democracy. I'm thinking in particular in there's a Euripides play where Theseus gives this great defense of Athenian democracy, meaning that in Athens, anyone who has an opinion can say it, will be listened to, will be heard, and that's what makes us a much stronger polity than you aristocratic or tyrannical Corinthians. And I think that there's recognizing that actually the diversity of viewpoints that we have in a democracy is our strength, not this thing we want to stamp out, is probably necessary for the survival of democracy.
That's a great theme to finish this conversation. Then thanks a lot. This was very, very interesting.
Thank you for all your great questions and for having me.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Civic Agora, brought to you by the Stanford Civics Initiative. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify, where you can discover more podcast episodes and gain access to additional information about the Stanford Civics Initiative. I'm your host, Javier Mejia. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.